Hello! So we're coming back to the Extra History series on the road to Pearl Harbor, the path to Pearl Harbor. And the second episode is called Mystery of the Panay, which, if my memory serves, and I believe that it does, the Panay was a riverboat that was struck by Japanese bombs during the Second Sino-Japanese War, during the invasion of China proper. And that's a problem, because Americans are injured. I think some Americans actually die. So it's almost like the Lusitania in the build-up to World War II compared to World War I. And we'll get into it and see how this goes. I am interested to see where they take it from here, but it does look like, given the closed caption at the bottom, it does look like we are going into the Second Sino-Japanese War and kind of setting up why Japan needs that huge amount of oil that they're eventually going to strike the U.S. to keep us away from, to go into the Dutch East Indies to get it. So let's take a look.
Yangtze River, December 12th, 1937. The Japanese dive bomber lets its payload go. The bomb smashing into the bow of U.S. Navy vessel USS Panay as sailors run to stations in disbelief. The U.S. and Japan are not at war. Part of the U.S. Navy's Asiatic Squadron, Panay is steaming away from the Chinese nationalist capital of Nanking, where it had evacuated civilians just before the city fell to the Japanese army. Now, it's escorting 3 standard oil tankers away from the burning city, fleeing reports of mass murder. Sailors run to shelter. One, still in his underwear, sprays machine gun fire at the fighters strafing the vessel. The captain is grievously wounded, and the vessel's second officer takes command, though moments later, shrapnel rips open his throat. He can't speak to issue orders, so he writes it on the bulkhead with his own blood. Abandoned ship.
Okay, so I didn't have the main details there. I knew that it was a ship along the Yangtze, and I knew that the Japanese attacked it. Few very cool things. First off, that is such a just insane way to have to give orders. To have to write that abandoned ship in your own blood is absolutely crazy. It's also not all that surprising. We get a horrific number of stories out of military conflict of similar things like that. Although, as he points out, we're not at war with Japan. Why on earth are they bombing American ships? You'll also notice why American ships are there. 2 things are happening. First off, the city of Nanking is about to fall to Japan, and I'm curious as to how they're going to cover it or if they're going to discuss it. But that is one of the most horrific civilian disasters ever in military conflict, is the fall of Nanking to the Japanese military in World War II. It is a horrific massacre. The number of war crimes committed, it's astronomical. And I'm curious as to how deep they're going to get into that specifically. And we see this today. American vessels go in and they get out American personnel. So that's the capital. Anybody that would have been in the American embassy would have put them on ships, would have taken them out. And a lot of times we've seen American ships that are bringing our people out will also grab civilians that are trying to get out of the area as well. That's not just the U.S. either. That's a lot of different countries if they have to pull out of a hostile zone. You'll also notice the other reason why we're there. The Standard Oil Tankers. That is the company built up initially by John D. Rockefeller, then broken up into many other groups. But 3 large oil tankers are on the river. And I'm curious, this is a complete shot in the dark, I'm curious if they attack the Panay with the hopes of capturing those Standard oil tankers for additional fuel in their efforts. Of course, realistically, it's probably just a case of mistaken identity. They didn't know what ship it was. We'll see, though. I am curious.
Thanks so much to World Anvil for helping us forge today's historical tale. It's December 18th, And in Tokyo, U.S. Ambassador to Japan Joseph Grew is trying to prevent a war. Accords signed after the Boxer Rebellion had allowed U.S. Navy gunboats like the USS Panay to patrol Chinese rivers and protect American commerce. To attack one violated international law, and the details did not look good. Japanese planes had sunk the Panay, along with the 3 standard oil tanker ships, killing 3 Americans and wounding 48. They'd even machine-gunned the lifeboats. This despite the fact that the Panay had radioed its position to Japanese forces and marked itself with 3 large American flags. In the U.S.,
so the idea of mistaken identity is just not working, of course. You have all those identifiers, and you have a clear line of communication back to the Japanese command saying, hey, we're here, don't shoot us. And we end up seeing the sinking of 4 American vessels. And you can see they also brought up the fact that this is a commercial treaty that allows us to here so that we can protect our business interests in the region. And that's why the standard oil tankers are what's being escorted out by the Panay.
The public mood was one of indignation. While there was also anger at Japan for what was being called the Rape of Nanking, the public treated the attack on the Panay as an even worse affront, particularly because they saw it firsthand. Most of the evacuees from Nanking had been journalists, and one filmed the attack from the Panay's deck. Ambassador Grew worried that, if it escalates, this incident could lead to war. It felt like the USS Maine all over again, especially since Grew's boss, President Franklin Roosevelt, was far more willing than his predecessors to confront what he privately called the bandit nations of Germany, Japan, and Italy. In October, Roosevelt had even given a speech calling for a quarantine of aggressive nations, arguing that America should take an active hand in containing the epidemic of world lawlessness. But Roosevelt had suffered such an isolationist backlash against that speech that even he hoped to defuse the Panay situation as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and that's a big deal. The U.S. throughout the 20s and 30s is isolationist. We had a lot of young men go off to Europe and never come back, or come back mutilated and maimed from the First World War, which a lot of Americans ultimately said, why were we there? And it's a bit harder to justify to a lot of people our involvement in the First World War compared to the Second. And as a result, people said, no, absolutely not. We're not getting involved in another foreign conflict. Keep us out. And we actually see in the next couple years following this, I believe the first one was actually passed in 1936, but we see a series of neutrality acts that are literally designed to prevent the U.S. from even supporting foreign combatants, because that would implicate us in the warfare, which is why the U.S. had ships being sunk back in World War I before we ever joined up. Now, let's go back here really quick. So, big isolationist backlash. The bandit nations, this is a big deal. Up to this point, we're only in 1937. We are not to the start of World War II. But Italy's already invaded and taken over Ethiopia. They've made threats in North Africa. Germany hasn't taken Austria yet, but they're looking at it. They're looking at the Rhineland. Japan has already invaded and taken over Manchuria in the early 1930s. And now we have a direct expansion into China proper. And a lot of people tend to forget about this. It's the failure and the lack of intervention and prevention in the Japanese expansions that make Germany and Italy go, well, if they didn't stop them, what are they going to do to us? And kind of fuel the buildup toward the isolation, not the isolationist movement, but the appeasement movement. This, I'm also going to point this out really quick. They absolutely thought it was the USS Maine all over again. I'm going to point out a major difference. The Japanese actually sunk the Panay. The Spanish did not sink the Maine. Now, of course, at the time, people didn't know that. But that's beside the point. It was a big deal. The last piece here, and a lot of people, I've heard a lot of people discuss, why on earth would people care more about this incident that killed 3 and wounded 40-something, 48? And are not appalled and angered by the rape of Nanking. There's something so much more visceral about actually being able to see the events firsthand. The use of video cameras in pictures really transformed the way that people thought about war and conflict and international intervention. And that is the perfect example of it. The rape of Nanking is arguably the worst war crime in human history. There are other events that are comparable. They're all just... they're so horrendous that it becomes almost difficult to actually quantify it. Because once you start trying to quantify it, you feel like you're leaving so much else out. Maybe one day we'll go back and take a look at it specifically. But for Americans being able to see the direct video of the Panay and knowing that those are Americans, knowing that those are their national brethren, their brothers, others, it does something different in your head. And it provides a much bigger piece for why you'd want to go to war and why you'd want to push for difference. Ultimately, though, that's not enough to actually change the course America's on at this point with the isolationist movement.
So, Gru reached out to contacts in Japan's civilian government and business community, as well as retired Admiral Nomura, who was connected to foreign policy circles. But no one seemed to know why the Panay had been attacked. Some said it was a mistake, while others said it might be a plot by low-level Japanese officers to scare American forces out of China. American radio intercepts suggested it was intentional. But Gru also found Japanese leaders receptive to his demand for an apology. Both Japan's government and public were mortified over the incident, and within days, the American embassy in Tokyo was besieged by letters of apology from Japanese citizens, including school children, along with envelopes stuffed with yen for the victims. On December 23rd, a Japanese delegation arrives at the U.S. Embassy to meet with Gru. They take full responsibility and designate a high-ranking naval officer to present a formal apology. In addition, they'll pay an indemnity of over $2 million to compensate the United States for the Panay and the 3 tankers. Yet they maintain that the attack was a case of misidentification. A pretty ludicrous position given the facts. But if it prevents a war, then it's a compromise Gru and Roosevelt are willing to make.
So we're going to take a step back here. We talked about this last time, in the last episode, about the fact that the Taisho democracy, the constitution that the Japanese democracy was built on, made the, I'm going to call it politely, horrifically misguided decision to separate the Japanese armed forces from the Japanese civilian government and make them effectively their own independent groups. The Japanese government was 100% horrified by what was happening. But the Japanese government was also 100% horrified when the Kwangtung Army invaded Manchuria in the early 30s. It's because they couldn't control the military because of the way that their constitution was structured. Now, there were militarists within Japan that were really gung-ho about this idea of conquest and fighting off the foreign threats. But a lot of people were just horrifically scared of what was happening and the implications that it brought with it. So, 100%, I fully believe that everybody in that government was just beside themselves horrified by what had happened. I also agree with them wholly that it was a ludicrous idea that this was a mistake given the previous things that have been mentioned. And to give you another bit here, and again, I said it before, I want to say it again. I highly recommend watching the Militarist series that they did previously. This is pretty much the same incident that led to the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. A group of lower-ranking Japanese military officials bombed a train in Manchuria with one of their allies on it to spark a war. And this feels hyper-similar. Alright. We're moving on with the Christmas Day apology here.
Apology arrives in Washington on Christmas Day, the fury over the attack diffused by the holiday season. In Tokyo, Japanese diplomats breathe a sigh of relief. For as much as Gru and Roosevelt want to avoid war, the Japanese government can't afford more complications in its Chinese quagmire. Despite early victories, it was becoming clear that in invading China, Japan had bitten off more than it could chew. The central government hadn't planned or even formally declared this war. It was capitulated into it by the actions of mid-level army officers, and there was no overall strategic plan or even an obvious goal. Instead, there were nebulous assertions about northern expansion and seizing resources. But the truth was, it was costing far more resources than it brought in, and the army's brazen massacres, 100%. Like at Nanking, were wrecking Japanese diplomatic efforts, which was dangerous. Because the Chinese theater was a mess of international forces, none of which Japan could afford to antagonize. First, there were American and British river gunboats like Panay, literally sailing through the conflict. Then Germany was present too, despite being part of an anti-communist pact with Japan. It sold the Chinese nationalists equipment and provided military advisors. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, wanting to support Mao's communists, had sent Soviet planes and pilots to shore up China's weak air forces and bomb Japanese bases. Which was double scary, since that risked Japan's greatest fear, war with the Soviet Union.
I love the use of the yokai, just screaming war. But this is something else that I feel like people kind of miss. The Axis powers is a very late 30s idea. The idea that Japan, Italy, and Germany are this immutable three-headed dragon working together is just kind of nonsense. And it's going to be something that really hurts them when they go to fight World War II, is the fact that they don't actually communicate properly. They don't coordinate or work together on these things. But that's a major issue here, is because of the fact that they aren't fully in line and working with these groups, then when the Germans show up, they go, nah, the nationalists could use some weapons, and we've got plenty to sell, because we're in the midst of fully rearming the country's military, so we're producing an insane amount, and we need to get rid of the old stock to replace it with new ones. So they have a perfect market in that form. And the existence of the Soviet threat to the north and its supply of Mao Zedong and his communist guerrillas make it almost impossible for the Japanese to bear their full brunt of their military on the front line against the nationalists, because now they've got communist guerrillas all across Manchuria and northern China wreaking havoc behind their lines, just destroying supplies, resources, and preventing them from getting things where they need to be.
Union. And then there was the United States itself, which was playing both sides. Popular sympathy in the U.S. lay solidly with China, seeing it as a victim of Japanese aggression, and the U.S. government supported the nationalist cause with supplies routed through French Indochina. Yet, paradoxically, America also supplied Japan with the high-grade fuel oil Japanese ships and planes used to pound nationalist forces. Any one of these powers risked getting dragged into the conflict. And despite what some militarist fanatics insisted, Japan could not simultaneously fight both a Western power and China. A thing that only became more clear as 1938 and 1939 dragged on, and Japan and China cut negotiations. Now it seemed the only path Japan had for victory was to conquer China. Japanese forces kept advancing, but now it was clear that nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek was intentionally giving up territory, using the vastness of his country against them, so they had to commit more resources into holding it. And while the Japanese army was spread increasingly thin, they also had to deal with Maoist guerrillas, which sabotaged coal mines and 100%. Other resources. Then in...
I'm going to also point this out here. That is a smart move to back off. It's worked plenty of times throughout human history. That's how the Russians beat Napoleon. Only by just pulling back and forcing them to overextend in their growth. But man, that's going to ultimately hurt Chiang when the war comes to an end and the Chinese Civil War restarts. Because a lot of people saw him as a coward who had fled away from the front lines and given up most of China to the Japanese to be ravaged and destroyed in those war crimes similar to Nanking. And while the strategy itself is a smart move to prevent total collapse, it definitely didn't play out for him in the long term in terms of internal politics. Although, who knows if they could have even stood and actually faced the Japanese military head-to-head. Because even without the strategy, the Japanese military tended to be better equipped and better prepped. But that's besides the point. Moving on, we're in July of 1939 now.
In July 1939, the most terrifying thing of all occurred. A group of militarist officers posted near the border with Mongolia made a unsanctioned border incursion against the Soviets, hoping to trigger a conflict that would let Japan seize Siberia. Instead, the Soviets encircled and smashed the Japanese forces, making planners question whether Japan could truly stand up to the full might of a Western power. Japanese diplomats, including Admiral Nomura, hastily concluded the conflict by recognizing the Soviet view of border claims. But it wasn't even a month before yet another diplomatic crisis gripped Tokyo, when Germany and the Soviet Union announced a non-aggression pact. Now, that was, as geopolitical scholars term it, a real dick move. The anti-communist treaty was supposed to align Japan and Germany against the Soviets, and now with
I believe it was actually called the Anti-Comintern, which the Comintern was the Soviet organization that was designed to export and send out the revolution to other regions. So, like, the Comintern would be the group that was supporting Maoist rebels primarily for the Soviet government. But this is exactly what they pointed out. A horrific problem for Japan. They've not only just had their small force just obliterated by the Soviet military, they now know that there are no plans, quote-unquote, no plans for the Germans and Soviets to fight each other. Notice the air quotes, because of course that doesn't keep up. That's very quickly kind of thrown out. We're also very quickly approaching the start of World War II in Europe. Some people are going to disagree with me here. There are 3 dates that you could argue are the start of World War II. Some people like to say December 7th, 1941. Those people are wrong. And before I know, most people are going to immediately go, I've never heard somebody say that that's when that happens. I live in backwoods Pennsylvania, America. There are people here who sincerely believe that World War II is not a true world war until the United States gets involved. The other date that most people talk about is September 1st, 1939, with the German invasion of Poland. Because that is what starts the armed hostilities in Europe that will progress all the way up into May of 1945 and bring Europe and North America, by extension, into this war by bringing Britain and France and their colonies, Africa and South America as well, because we still see territories across Africa, and a few, specifically one French-controlled territory, French Guiana, in South America that would still be considered. But that makes sense for a lot of people. I would argue that realistically, if we want the truest kind of extent, we'd have to go back to the Japanese invasion in 37 of China proper. Because it lasts from that invasion in 37 all the way up to August of 45, and September if you include how long it took to actually get the armistice signed or the peace treaty signed. So we're moving on here. But yeah, this is a major problem if you're Japan to see Germany and the Soviet Union working together. And now all of your plans are borderline collapsing. It's not going well for them.
Without even telling Japan, Germany had concluded an agreement that gave the USSR peace on its western border, which meant that the Soviets could, theoretically, turn all their attention toward invading Manchuria and Japan. Y'all, I'm starting to feel like this Hitler guy might be a little untrustworthy. Meanwhile, shipments of American aircraft parts were suddenly drying up. It turned out that Roosevelt, while not making any public announcement, had privately requested American aircraft manufacturers to stop selling to Japan. Then, in July of 1939, Roosevelt escalated by canceling America's commercial treaty with Japan, effective January 1940. Not only would this be a commercial hit, but it removed the legal protections against the United States declaring an embargo. What would happen? Japanese officials began to ask if he shut off our oil. Yet in that dark period, a window of opportunity opened. Germany invaded Poland in 1939, plunging Europe into war, and by June 1940, had swept across France and the Netherlands. So
at this point, and I'm sure they're about to get into it, so at this point, if you're Japan, French Indochina, what is today Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, suddenly doesn't have a functional government because France has collapsed and there are now two competing governments, the government in exile under Charles de Gaulle and the Vichy government under, Pinal? Starts with a P, and I can't remember it. But that's open. The Netherlands fall. Indonesia, which is one of the largest or just oil fields on the planet, is now open for the taking. England, its colonies all throughout South Asia. What's it going to do? It's stuck in a fight with Germany and Europe. They can't fight us. They can't keep up with us. That leaves a major threat left. One major threat left, and it's the group that controls the faucet to their oil in the mean term.
While Japan's northern expansion strategy, favored by the army, had clearly failed, because China was a quagmire and the Soviets too dangerous, the Imperial Japanese Navy's rival strategy of striking down into Southeast Asia to seize the rubber-producing regions of British Malaya and the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies was now suddenly possible.
Absolutely.
With the English, French, and Dutch busy fighting Germany, they wouldn't be reinforcing their positions halfway around the world. So for a brief time, the colonies of Asia appeared up for grabs. Japan could sweep in fast, just as Germany had overrun France. But that window might not be open for long. Heck, Germany itself might snap them up. The rallying cry, "Don't miss the bus," echoed throughout the government, capturing the feeling of escalation and frantic activity. Japan's first step, it was decided, would be to move into French Indochina and cut the Western supply lines to nationalist China. And so as Nomura took a ship for Washington as his country's new ambassador, and Roosevelt mulled more sanctions, Japan drew up troops on the border with French Indochina, preparing for its third undeclared war in 3 years, a war that would put it on a collision course with the United States. Oh man, Zoe, the lead up to Pearl Harbor is full of so many things to keep track of. I don't know how these world powers handled it before digital computers. Heck, I'm not sure how they handled it before World Anvil.
All right. We're going to skip ahead. I believe that, yeah, I'm just double checking. Yep. So we'll pick up with the third episode, but you can already see how things are kind of shifting and how things are starting to play out, that everything's kind of going bad for the Japanese invasion of China and how it's starting to kind of collapse in on itself. Now, the Army and Navy, which are very much so at odds with each other, the Kwangtung Army that was initially invaded, and then the Japanese Army in general, needed a lot of the same materials that the Japanese Navy needed to function and really bring the full brunt to bear. But now that's not really going to happen. Now the Japanese Navy is taking their shot, and basically, you have two very different structures and organizations, both trying to play their hand at conquest, which is going to drain Japan's resources even faster. And I'm sure that we'll start seeing that next time. All right. Have a good day. See you in the next one. Bye.